No, it wasn't. It wasn't. What we're going to have to do is briefly that resources. See, why last week to get it up is about 200. We got two. And probably, and then again, just make sure everything else is going to be true on some of that. Say Bibles like that, which are wonderful. Yes. But yeah, 11:41 as I'm walking. Yeah.
Well, listen, you could have just kept going.
Oh, I appreciate that.
I need to be on the projector one, right?
Yeah, here's the projector Wi-Fi.
I think I am. See me?
Nope. No, you hit the Wi-Fi. I can see the Wi-Fi. I see the projector. You do have it.
Yeah, I'm doing that. Was there. It's thinking. It's acting like it.
He's got a
I want to be on the projector.
Wi-Fi's having a projector, and then AirPlay is going to be on. There you go. There you go.
It seems to direct to the other one. All right, we're good. All right. Good morning, everyone. It's a beautiful fall day. Katie and I did not stay at the campsite, but we did sign up to go down, and it was really just perfect weather for that. And it was quite a crew down there. The children definitely outnumbered the adults. So that was a really fun dynamic down there. So today we will get to 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 25. But you can tell from the title slide, which just hopped off here, let me see if I get it back here, that what I decided for as a theme verse for the class, let's see here. For some reason I lost it here. It's thinking. There we go. What I had chosen for the theme verse for the class is chapter 2, verse 21, the end of it there, because it uses that great little phrase in his steps. And such a nice little phrase to kind of describe what it means to be a Christian. But I'm always a little torn because I think another great verse out of 1 Peter is chapter 3, verse 15. It says, "But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asked you to give an account for the hope that is within you, yet with gentleness and reverence. If I had a second choice, that would be my second choice. And I do recall I went to both Harding University and Oklahoma Christian. At Oklahoma Christian, I attended the Wilshire congregation, and Willie Franklin was the campus minister at the time, and he literally spent an entire quarter on that verse. That was the verse for the entire quarter, and it's a really powerful verse, and we're going to get to it in a couple of weeks, so that's a little bit of a tease. But in his steps is the theme, and I think there's so many ways that it's appropriate for Peter, for example. I picked the image of footsteps along a seashore. That would have been something that Peter would have been very familiar with. There's a poem, I think, that's very popular. I think it's called Footprints or something like that. But there's all kinds of analogies that talk to us about the path and walk of being a Christian that are indicative of this kind of following along in someone's steps. It's not as applicable in the South, but sometimes the analogy is given of following in steps in the snow. And sometimes a child following behind a parent's steps in the snow. And not something that's normally you can even do here because the snow's rarely even that deep. But for anybody who's lived up north a while and been in 20-inch snows, the children have a lot of hard time moving in that snow. And like if you have a dog or whatever, you might have to actually trailblaze a path for them to even be able to go out into the snow. But the analogy of one of the commentaries I use when I'm preparing for this class that I think is most appropriate, and I think is appropriate for today, is a little different. It's not stepping in the footsteps, but rather it's when we learn how to write. Often what we do is trace the letters. So the letters are given for us, and then we have to trace them. And why I think that's such a beautiful analogy is because what do those look like when we've traced them? You might be able to read it, right? It has a lot of similar characteristics, but it deviates a little from that path a little bit, but directionally correct, right? And I think that's probably a more realistic analogy for our path as Christians. So when we look at 1 Peter, we've kind of been building up, or I've treated the class as if it's building up because, I think even more so than the book of James, James really appeals to the practical first. I think Peter is really appealing to this idea of transformation because he starts us with this idea in chapter 1 that we're to rejoice with various trials. And we're going to talk about that today as well as this idea of what is our attitude when we suffer, when there's various trials that come our way. And then we talked about having this mindset of being exiles or strangers in this earth and this appeal to holiness. And last week we talked about this idea that we're a royal priesthood, that we fulfill that role in the Christian dispensation. And one of the conversations I had after class with Rick was this reminder in Exodus 19 that idea of every God follower being part of the priestly order is present there. And I think that's true. We see it in the book of Hebrews. We see it in the fact that Hebrews describes Jesus as after the order of Melchizedek. He wasn't part of the Levi lineage, but was still a priest. And so the same thing is true of a lot of things in the Christian dispensation, where we can look at Old Testament references of prophecy that predict what happened, but you can't really see them until you look through the eyes of the cross. It brings a deeper and deeper meaning. And that is really going to be epitomized in the topic for today, I think, because it's one of the, if I could say, it's one of my talking points. So it's kind of good we talked about 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21, because there's a risk I might not get to it. Because I think it is a really relevant topic to us today, because Peter's going to address taking this idea of having our focus and mindset of this not being our home, having a focus and mindset that we need to live holy lives in reverence to God because of what He did for us, back into kind of our daily walk in terms of how we interact or how we think of authority on this earth. And this is an area where, part of maturing as Christians and being godfathers is one of the highest challenges for us, because the root of most sin and most of our trouble, especially on the emotional spectrum, is we don't get what we want. That's where it comes from. It comes from not getting what we want. And that's going to be very true in the matters we're going to discuss today. So to set a little bit of a frame for that, we're to submit to authority. And I use the image here, one that we're familiar with, some of our founding documents, a gavel, institutions of authority that we're very familiar with. The way I like to look at history and think about history is what would have been like for me to live as just a common person in that time. So as we get started here, I just want us to talk about who the leader was in that day and some of the things that were going on in that time. And it doesn't have to be exact. I know there's disputes and historians on different things. But Nero was the emperor. He was the Caesar at the time. And he was very notorious for several things. But just to give you an idea of who he was, even on a personal level, he had his own mother killed. This is not a good person. There were all kinds of politicking and really things that we would just be completely appalled in our society that went on during that time with the emperors of that day and in the old world. The other thing that Nero is really known for is the burning of Rome. Does anybody know the phrase that we often talk about when we talk about Nero and the burning of Rome? It has something to do with music. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Some speculate that he actually, I see that I got cut off a little bit there, but he actually intentionally let Rome burn, because he would soon after build what would be his palace. And his palace was so immense and was later, after his demise, taken back over, that just a small portion of it is where the Colosseum is now. So if you can just imagine. So here's this guy that was very interested in himself. In fact, another thing we know about Nero is that he competed in the Olympic Games himself. He started off in the chariot race, and of course there was a time where he fell off, but somehow he still won. But he was known actually for winning every competition he was in. And the people hated him for it because he just was not a great person. And then we know that after his reign, he was also kind of hunted down and attempted to take his own life. I guess some historians say that someone had to help him do that. But we often as Christians talk about the persecution that the Christians suffered, and most of that was centered in Rome. But he was known for, blaming the burning of Rome on Christians, using Christians as scapegoats, and doing things like using Christians as human torches, if you can just imagine how horrific that is, and throwing Christians to wild animals and so on, and in various different ways that we're not going to get into this morning. But the other kind of aspect of why Christians became such a threat is for the same reason that Jesus was crucified, and the same reason why the Jews saw Jesus as a threat, is because the language around Jesus was he was king, right? So we see that play out in the story of the crucifixion. So to the Rome, you were supposed to attribute words that the Christians would attribute only to Caesar. into Rome. And so you became a pariah just by speaking biblically about your faith. But the Christians that we're talking about here are far from Rome. They're in this dispersed area, what's now modern-day Turkey. They would have been subject to Roman government, but much more so from that regional area. So it'd be the difference between living in Washington, D.C. or living in Middle Tennessee. So we feel somewhat removed from the politicking that goes on in D.C. here. And it would have been the same for them. So we don't have records historically and secularly of as horrific of events happening for their region as what we hear about in Rome, but certainly they would have been aware of what was happening there. And that was the world that they lived in. So with that in mind, we're going to jump into the text. So the first statement here is, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake, this is chapter 2, verse 13, to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority or to governors as set by him, for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. So we can see in this statement perhaps some reference to Rome, because they would have worked in a situation where they would have distributed authority through governors locally. But it's also a very generic statement. The beauty of Christianity is that it can work regardless of the form of government that we're in. And of course, we often refer to this as being submissive to the government for good reason. We're going to look at some parallel passages here in just a moment. There's probably three main texts in the New Testament that kind of address this issue. But it's not so descriptive to say that we're focusing just on what was happening the other day, what was happening with Rome. It's more relative to all time and to everybody, no matter what governmental system they find themselves in. And I think that's important. But the other thing is we kind of formatively think about these verses. I also like to think about the fact that while we're far removed from it and it was slightly different, we adopt a lot of our own governmental structure from the Roman Empire. So we're kind of set up in a similar way. And it leads us to that kind of question is, for us personally, where do we view the government and submitting to the government in our lives? And under our form of government, a representative republic, we have things that you don't necessarily have in other forms of government, right? We have a Bill of Rights. We have rights that we stand up and say that we have to defend, for example. Whereas if we were to live under a communist dictator, let's say, maybe it would be different. So we wouldn't have those rights. And yet, the verses apply. But I think it's good for us to kind of think about these verses, understanding that this is to work regardless of the form of government, because it's not about what happens in this life, but also to think about it in terms of, are there particular challenges for me because of the form of government that I am part of? And I think this is personal to me too. You know, we all have core pursuits and core interests, and I have to admit that mine is being aware of what's going on politically and geopolitically. I was a talk news junkie all the way back to the days of Paul Harvey. And so that's something that's interested me. It's something that's been part of my work to understand what's going on economically, globally. And so it's very easy to get wrapped up in that. But in addition to that, you know, our government has some semblance and some reflections of Christian principles. So we have to keep that all in mind as we think about these things. But to the audience that Peter's writing to, thinking about what they were seeing in their government, how challenging would it be just to mentally make that leap that I need to submit to that? It would be a challenge. It would not be where Peter started. It would be where Peter finished. Because during Jesus' ministry, he was always the one to open his mouth and want the kingdom to be established now. We remember he drew a sword to cut off Malchus's ear. So he was prepared to establish this earthly kingdom. And yet now, when we get into 1 Peter, he's starting to have this other completely different idea that's based on putting God and Christ as king rather than any kind of human government. But if you look at the verse 14, it really gives us what we need to know, that the government's responsibility, what the expectation really, in a sense of God as of governments, is to enforce laws, to enforce some form of civility. It's the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right is the essential function of government. Dan did a great lesson on this back in the summer, but unfortunately I don't think it got recorded, because when I went online to see if it was there, I didn't see an actual recording. So maybe that'll come back, but I think he did such a great job with that. So a couple of parallels here. Romans 13, this whole section is, but specifically to deal with the two topics that are raised here. Every person is to be subjected to the governmental authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. And then he also adds to this, render to all whom is due, tax to whom tax is due. So it has this idea of paying taxes. Of course, we see the same thing in Jesus' ministry. 1 Timothy chapter 2, again, this urge in this case to pray for our government. First of all, then, I urge that entreaties and prayers and petitions and thanksgiving be made on behalf of all men, for kings and all who are in authority, so that they may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. Now, I think this is an important verse because I think it frames for us what our responsibility is, or what our expectation is of government, in line with what Peter talks about. It's not that we have a Christian form of government. It's not that everything gets fixed by the government, that our lives improve because of the government. It's that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. It's that there's enough semblance of civility and punishment of good and evil that God's work can be done. But we know that throughout the course of history, whether you go back to the Old Testament or even to the New Testament, that what the government does in aggregate, just for your own experience, might seem to be evil and wrong, God can often use for good. In fact, these very letters that we often group together here with Peter and James came about probably because of the persecution the government was conspiring to do, led to scattering of people. And when God's people get scattered, what happens? The church grows. And so there are times where we have to kind of put on our lenses through, like, what's the ultimate good that gets accomplished by what happens in these geopolitical situations, not what happens for me. But I find, this whole concept of being, submissive to the government and disconnecting my wants for what happens with government to my belief in following God's word to be a little challenging, because if you're kind of connected to politics and want to see good happen, you want to see good things happen in government, you want to see a movement of the country towards God, it can be kind of a challenging process. But for these early Christians, it was so much the opposite, because the government was really a source of persecution. There wasn't a form of government that was really being, backed up by Christian principles. So the submission to authority is, in verse 15, the will of God. And it's the will of God that we lead these holy lives where we're not acting out kind of as a response to how we're treated to silence the opposition. Again, this is going to get elevated here, but it's this idea that our job is not to jump in and try to change the world through the government or to do anything other than submit to the government, regardless of what's going on in the government, because our behavior silences the opposition. In verse 16, it expands on that thought to act as free men and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bond slaves of God. How is it that Peter could make that statement, considering the circumstances, to act as free men? How were they free? How were they free? They have this circumstance where there's a lot of persecution that came from the government. How are they free? How can they act as free men in light of their circumstances? That's correct. Act as if you're free. How do you act as if you're free? You live for God. It's that simple. There is this incredible freedom when you can frame your life around God's picture. So you can have tremendously terrible things happen in your life, but still have a sense of freedom because you realize this is temporal, it's temporary. And we've already mentioned it, we'll mention here again, but Peter more than once will say, don't fear man, fear God, because what can man do to you? So despite horrific persecution, we can act as if we're free. It's an interesting concept. And don't use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bond slaves. So here's this idea that we can kind of elevate our position knowing that we're not concerned about what happens in this life and become kind of confrontational about it, or we can submit. Those are kind of the two competing ideas. And he'll refer to this a couple times. And then he gives us some imperatives in verse 17. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. Now, if we go back to the original language and we look at some of our different modern translations, sometimes this list looks a little different. In the New American Standard is what I use. It kind of looks like a list, not really taking that first one and expanding it. But if you look at the original text, that first one may be more an underline imperative that the other ones fall into. It doesn't really make a big difference in how we understand the concepts. But I think it does help set a tone when you understand it, that first one has a little bit of a different tense to it. Because it's this call for us to show proper respect to everyone. The NIV does a good job here. And that is really kind of the call of following Christ, isn't it? That regardless of circumstances, regardless of where we find ourselves or who we're dealing with, we show respect towards everyone. Even our enemies, even those who persecute us, even those who are in a position of high authority that do evil. We show respect for that. As we get to the end of this section, There's going to be an appeal to those who are in slavery or bond slavery, but it's hard for us to relate to that. I think it really, really falls short to just lower that to just relating it to the workplace, but I think it's helpful to us in our society. But if we're in a situation where we just do not like our boss, what's the right thing to do in that circumstance? If we don't like our boss, if we don't like our our direct manager, can we show the proper respect to that person? Yeah, we can. And so here's these other imperatives: to love the brotherhood, to fear God, and to honor the king. And that kind of summarizes this section. But when we've been talking about, when we talk about the application here, relating it towards emotional intelligence. And if you think about it, all these things take a lot of emotional intelligence. It takes a lot of self-awareness, a lot of self-regulation, a lot of social awareness. So it's really kind of the epitome of this idea. He's going to jump to, again, a slightly different element of this. And like I said, we sometimes relate this to the work situation because in our society, we don't see the same circumstance where people are actually in a slavery situation. And I'm not going to try to address this as the entire Bible could address it, and we could look through history to see how this has changed and how Christendom largely changed the concept of this. But when you think about it, the epitome of understanding what it means to submit in that culture was what a servant was subjected to, because they were so incredibly vulnerable to this idea of submitting, regardless of what the circumstances were, whether you had a good master in this case or an unreasonable master. So servants, be submissive to your master with all respects, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable, for this finds favor if for the sake of conscience towards God a person bears up under sorrow when suffering unjustly. And I think, like I said, we don't have this exact analogy. We do know that today, in the world today, that there are people that are subject to a form of slavery, although it's not on the front page, it's more hidden. But we know human trafficking is real, and people being exploited and put into this type of situation is real. There are many, many people in this world that are subject to this today. But for us to kind of think about the situation they're in is going to point us towards this idea of following in Jesus' steps, which we're about to get to the theme verse. For what credit is there if when you sin or are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. So he's starting to give us this idea that if we don't lead a life of holiness, if we don't put our Christian principles first, then what credit is it? Because we're just getting punished for doing what's wrong, which we understand that's just part of this world. A good parallel for this is Luke chapter 6. It's just, again, it's sometimes referred to as the golden rule in verse 31. Treat others the same way you want them to treat you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even the sinners do the same. So he's really preparing us for this mindset, and he's pointing towards what will ultimately be this idea of following in Jesus' suffering. And he's getting us there and connecting it to this idea of those who were bond slaves or bond servants that were exceedingly vulnerable and susceptible to suffering innocently. And he's saying, when it comes to the governmental authority, when it comes to your particular station in life, you may be called to suffer unjustly. And here in this verse here, it tells us that this finds favor with God. So here's our verse, the theme, if you will, for the class. So if you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps. So this is kind of the pinnacle, I think, of 1 Peter's message and also kind of Peter's message to us. And we saw it playing out in Peter's life, because what was a time where Peter was unwilling to do this? Just before the cross, right? He denied the Lord 3 times. What if he had said, oh no, I was with him? He would have probably suffered a similar fate to Christ. Maybe he would have been, instead of those 2 thieves, maybe Peter would have been up there. But at that time, he was unwilling to suffer. But Peter is appealing to all Christians and saying, you have been called for the purpose of suffering. Well, that's a challenging concept, and it's difficult for us to get our minds around it. And if you really think about it, if we're to follow in Christ's steps, there's no time that we more closely look like Christ than when we're willing to suffer unjustly. There's no time that we're more like Christ as human beings than when we're willing to suffer, not for something that we did that was wrong, but for suffering for something that is unjust. He then leaps to familiar passage to us, quoting from Isaiah chapter 53, which gives us this beautiful picture of the spirit that Christ was able to have when looking towards the cross. So he took us from not submitting to the government. Look at slaves who are these incredibly vulnerable people that are susceptible to innocent suffering, and then leading us to the example of the cross with these beautiful words, he committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth, and while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to the one who judges righteously, and he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness, for by his wounds we are healed. So it's really just this ultimate example of what it means to suffer as a Christian. And we will spend 2 more classes on this in later weeks. But if you think about the extreme emotional intelligence that it takes to be able to do this, he brings it back to us again, saying very quickly and acknowledging in verse 25, for you are continually straying like sheep, but now have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. Again, going back to Isaiah 53, Jesus is like a lamb before his shears is silent, and then he relates this idea that Jesus being the master shepherd, we continually stray like sheep, but we're supposed to always return to this example of Christ. So here's the challenge for us as Christians in today's world, and I would say as Christians in this country. The temptation for us and our society kind of teaches, even within our system of government and in our popular culture not to be submissive, but rather to enforce one's own law. And if you think about it, what's glorified in our popular culture? It's kind of this getting back, this kind of revenge mentality, whether it's in the movies or TV shows. We kind of root for this idea of getting back. And we see this same kind of character arc, if you will, in Peter. In John 18, I mentioned it before, his inclination was to pull out the sword. And sometimes that's our inclination too. But yet, Peter takes it a different way when he looks at it through the cross. Here's another example where literally Peter was trying to walk in Jesus' step. In Matthew chapter 14, we see Jesus walking on the water, and Peter gets out and walks on the water, in a sense, following in his steps. But then what happens? His faith wanes, and he starts to sink. And then we see this transformation in Acts of Peter, where he didn't have the opportunity to suffer with Christ right before the crucifixion. He later repented. Jesus kind of restored him, and yet he becomes this pillar of the church and preaching the first gospel in Acts 2 to the Jews and then to the Gentiles in Acts chapter 10. But in between those two events, we find the situation where he was beaten and he walks away rejoicing. Such a powerful ability to place your emotions in this state where I can rejoice even when I'm suffering wrongly. And that's the power of this idea of suffering as a Christian. Almost every class, towards the end of the class, I've ended it with asking a question that's kind of different for us, I think, because we're very careful to say that our feelings aren't a very good guide, because they're not. When you look at this idea of suffering for something unjustly, your untrained feelings tell you to do what? To retaliate. To offer like tit for tat. That you don't deserve this. This is unjust. I deserve justice, for what's happening to me. That's your untrained emotional state. So towards the end of each class, I've asked this question: how do you feel about some of these concepts that Peter has proposed? Not because how you feel about it is a guide, but how you feel about it is actually a measure, not of your understanding of God's word, but where you are in this journey of developing this emotional intelligence to be able to handle some of these things that Peter talks about. Because I would say in our culture, the idea of submitting is not popular or easy or normal. I mean, we've already talked about it, but instead of submitting, we say what? I've got my rights. You're infringing upon, something that is owed me. Now, I think there are opportunities that we have to rightly defend ourselves and use the governmental system that we're in and use the law in reasonable ways. Do we see any examples under this Roman issue of Christians doing that? Using the rules of that day to be effective? Sure we do. Paul does it, right? He appealed to Caesar as a means to have an audience with Caesar, but also when he was being treated unjustly, you weren't to do certain things to a Roman citizen. And Paul says, wait a second, I'm a Roman citizen. And they became afraid, remember? So we can exist and utilize the forms of government, but ultimately we submit to God's authority, and we submit to our enemies, because in doing so, we silence them. It's a difficult concept. The second one there is, how do I feel about suffering unjustly? There's a story of Marshall Keeble, the gospel preacher, who was doing a tent meeting, and in the middle of speaking, someone came up and just struck him in the face with a closed fist and knocked him to the ground. And he got up and just continued to preach. And he just said, sometimes Christians just have to take it. And, I think that's really the appeal that Peter's making, is that if we can really raise our awareness, our emotional intelligence, we can see that when we suffer something in this world, knowing that there's ultimately value in it for the next world, and also to be kind of this example to the world, to be that royal priesthood, to be that chosen people, then we have really accomplished this idea of following in his steps. That's the epitome, I think, of what it means to be a Christian. Okay, I've done a lot of talking. We have just a couple minutes left. Any comments, questions?
When this talks about suffering unjustly,
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes we think about that it's just any unfairness.
Mm.
And I don't think it's any unfairness. I think that it is more to do with when we're sharing the gospel and when we're trying to live out a Christ-like life. And I think we need to be careful, because there's a lot of unfairness in the world
Yeah.
that we have to live with. And that's not necessarily suffering unjustly, I guess.
There's a balance there, but so far too often we end up on the wrong side of the balance, right? If you think about it, even amongst ourselves, in 1 Corinthians, they were having a lot of trouble in 1 Corinthians with infighting. And what was the statement was made? Isn't it better to be wronged than to take this to a court outside the church? So there are times where we have some ability with self-preservation and other things, not just to suffer for every circumstance, but that willingness. Let's say, for example, something happens at work where, someone treats you very poorly. There are times when you can act out on that and rightly stand up for yourself. And maybe it doesn't have a big spiritual ramification, but to stop and think, if I just kind of let that go, could it yield better fruits? You just have to ask the question. Yes?
Often we have a tendency to want to do God's job and retaliate.
Yep.
God tells us, vengeance is mine, I will repay.
Yep.
And sometimes we want to take his job away from him and do it ourselves.
Very good. Like I said, we get to spend 2 more weeks on this. So I think we can unpack it a little bit more. But I do think, in that day, in the world that they lived in, one of the biggest tools for evangelism was to simply, allow yourself on occasion to suffer unjustly. And if you look at it from the 2 classes ago, I think it was, there was this language of, by our lives of holiness, we will be looked at as evil. And that's where it really comes in. So there is this kind of balance there. All right, we're over time. We got one more. Go ahead. One more.
So when we talk about suffering Christians, I think about India.
Hmm.
The suffering that they you're a peaceful religion, because they're not used to that. So
Oh.
I think of this, if we retaliate, if we show that, then we're showing them that, no, we're not a peaceful religion.
Interesting.
So, because they're not used to.
So in India, they're not used to this concept of a peaceful
Right,
religion.
because Hindu is peaceful, but obviously, and Muslim is not, and that's what they're used to having come in as the Muslim and not being peaceful. So they're like, oh, they're very surprised. Oh, you're a peaceful religion.
I think too, in the modern era where their Christendom is so prolific, you know, that gets confusing over when to stand up for your rights or not to suffer. But think how radical this concept was in the first century. There was no religion that would teach anything close to this idea of, you know, maybe it's okay because you're not worried about an earthly kingdom. You're worried about the next kingdom. So we're over time. Thank you, everybody. I never know if this is going to be a lecture or a discussion, but more lecture today. More discussion next week.